Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm Kati Tovah, a fundamentalist escapee. I got out in 2014 and now I use my first-hand knowledge to try to help take these groups down. This video is the full compilation of my three-parter on Jill Duggar-Dillard's memoir, Counting the Cost. I originally released the mini-series in my Kati Tovah Reads playlist, and in light of the recent arrests, I decided to release it as part of my Duggar Downfall series. Please share these videos far and wide so we can finally destroy the patriarchy. All right, without further ado, I give you my discussion of Counting the Cost.
Hi, hello. Today I'm going to be unpacking Jill Duggar-Dillard's memoir, Counting the Cost. This is Jill's account of growing up on TV and being exploited by her father and the IBLP cult. That stands for Institute for Basic Life Principles. So there will be references to topics like abuse, and I'll be as vague as possible and only bring up specific details when it's relevant for the discussion. And I'll hold up a card during those parts. Jill's father and mother are named Jim Bob and Michelle, and I will be referring to Jim Bob as JB for short. When I'm reading direct quotes, I will be holding up the book, but since I can't read regular print very quickly anymore, I put the quotes in my script, so I will be reading them off of my teleprompter. So I covered the whole brouhaha with Jill's older brother Josh in previous videos. In one of the videos, I briefly mentioned Bill Gothard, and the start of IBLP. If you're completely in the dark on this subject, I would watch those videos first, and I will link both of them down below. I also recommend watching the Prime docuseries Shiny Happy People. It covers the IBLP and other IBLP survivors in general, but Jill appears prominently as well. When I started reading this, I was taken aback by how much the Duggar family turned heads in their own town. Jill grew up in Arkansas. I've lived in the Midwest my entire life, and my only experience with the South was a few trips to Florida. So I was surprised that they were turning heads even in the South from very early on. Of course, I knew going into that JB was very politically conservative, but after reading this book, I realized there's a difference between being politically conservative and being culturally traditional. So politically conservative would mean voting Republican, obviously, and cultural things aren't specific to one political party. For example, if you look at photos from like the civil rights movement, we would call the clothing style traditional by our modern standards, but that is not directly tied to politics. I know that sounds confusing, so I'll give an example. When Jill's family went to the beach, it was perfectly normal to see other women and girls in two-piece suits, like I would see here in the Midwest, and Southern families who weren't really funny extremists listen to a lot of the same music as average families in the Midwest. Those are things that are not specific to one political party. I hope that makes sense. As said, I've never lived in the South, so learning that they stood out just as much there really surprised me. Okay, so now let's go back to the topic of music. Music is powerful. All right, we all know that. Music was a big part of the civil rights movement and Vietnam War protests in America in the 60s onward. And because music is powerful, cult leaders try to control it. The Nazis banned swing music. The Islamic Revolution in Iran banned Western pop in the 70s and 80s. And then after the Satanic Panic, you had people who thought that regular rock music was the work of Satan. I'm going to share a quote that illustrates how the Duggar parents used music as a control tactic. Quote, "At times, music was a distraction. Mom used it as a tool to break us out of a cranky mood or inject a little joy when it was needed. Other times, she'd use it as a motivator to keep us on task as we folded laundry or unloaded groceries. Whatever the reason for pressing play, she used it wisely. Music had power, and it could be turned off as easily as it was turned on, especially if someone mentioned the D word. Look," one of my younger siblings would say quietly to another little Duggar, "I'm dancing." Click. Silence. End quote. Let's take a look at this with the BITE model criteria. I'll post the link to the BITE model in the description. The B stands for behavior control, and the E stands for emotion control. Let me be clear, this is not the same thing as teaching children how to regulate their behavior or their emotions. You can absolutely impart those concepts in healthy ways. With behavior control, we're talking about behaviors that are not inherently problematic, such as dancing or listening to music. This is a manipulation tactic. This is the adult avoiding difficult behavior or emotions. Another part of behavior and emotion control is what we call coded language. Cults often have their own vernacular. For instance, in NXIVM, questioning the teachings in any way was called being a suppressive person. In mainstream society, we use the term to suppress to mean like stuffing down / suppressing emotions like anger. But in NXIVM, it meant something different. In these fundy groups, the word secular is used a lot. Now, in the regular world, it means not religiously affiliated. It's a neutral descriptor. In fundy circles, it's used as an insult, particularly toward women. A secular woman means a woman who's educated, has a career, etc. I got called secular a lot because I didn't grow up this way and I had a college degree in early childhood and all of that. Another big one is stirring up contention among the brethren, which is a line from the New Testament. The general mainstream interpretation of this is along the lines of, don't go starting arguments over minor things. In these communities, it basically means don't go spreading or getting dangerous ideas. I kind of did exactly that, and that's how I became elder enemy number one. Okay, one of Bill Gothard's fudged up ideas was child training. The first time I heard those words, I thought back to my service dog training, and the training we used was both very humane and very effective, but applying that kind of method to a child is so not okay. In these communities, parental authority doesn't stop when a child turns 18 or gets married. They cite a verse from Proverbs that goes, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Part of converting to Judaism is learning at least some Hebrew. And while I'm by no means an expert on it, I will say that these texts have vastly different meanings in the original languages. Grown adults in these communities really struggle to have their own opinions and make their own decisions. I had a friend who would give responses like, my dad says X, when I asked her opinion on things. I remember once I said, I didn't ask you what your dad thinks, I asked what you think. I don't remember what she said, but she looked at me like I had three heads. Thinking for yourself is akin to treason in this kind of group. It's not a small thing. And this had very damaging real-world ramifications. Quote, IBLP also encouraged parents to clip their children's wings. They taught that children should stay with their parents until marriage, and instead of going away to college, children should stay home and pick up other safer trades for work. They encouraged fathers to be self-employed, build up family businesses, and have their boys work for them. It was a clear way of keeping a full-grown adult offspring into the role of dependent children. Back then, seen through the eyes of my younger self, it seemed like a great plan. I didn't have any intention of leaving home or trying to make a life for myself on my own. Why would I? The world was dangerous and full of peril. End quote. No wonder so many survivors relate to the Disney movie Tangled. Hi, shalom. This video contains brief mentions of CSA, or childhood sexual abuse. There isn't any detail, and it's relevant to the discussion. References to the traditional male-female binary and traditional gender roles are used in context, and this does not reflect my own views. Just like in part 1, I will be holding up the book when I'm reading direct quotes while doing the actual quote reading off of my script with my teleprompter. All right, so this is part 2 of my discussion on Jill Duggar Dillard's memoir, Counting the Cost. If you didn't watch part 1, you're going to want to do that first. I will link that down below. And if you're completely new to the subject, you will probably want to head over to my shorter 2-part overview on the Quiverful movement and everything with Josh Duggar. I will link all of that down below. Just like in part 1, I will be referring to Jill's father, Jim Bob Duggar, as JB, and her mother's name is Michelle. So I ended part 1 right before JB and Michelle found out about Josh abusing Jill and some of her sisters. Now, before I get into that, I want to explain how the concept of modesty and sexual temptation, how all that's viewed in these groups. If you think of modesty by any mainstream standards, you might think of not wearing revealing clothing or how Muslim women wear the hijab. And I choose to observe sinut, or modesty, as part of my Jewish practice. Most of the time I cover my shoulders and my knees when I'm in public. I often wear skirts or long tops over my jeans, and I always cover shoulder and knees for synagogue. For me, that's empowering. It's empowering to choose who sees what. I personally hate feeling objectified, but again, it's my choice. And that's not how these groups look at modesty at all. It's not about women and girls being empowered and making their own choices. Women and girls are expected to dress modestly so as not to cause men or boys to fall into temptation. So if a woman or a girl is assaulted, the assumption is generally that she wore or did something that caused it. It's a much more extreme version of the whole "what was she wearing" bullshit. And it goes way beyond just clothing. Let's say, for instance, there was a woman who was in the middle of reading a romance novel at the time of the assault. If the elders found out about it, they might say she brought on the assault herself by deciding to read that novel. Keep all of that in mind as we continue to move through the book. And I cannot emphasize enough that both the CSA and the parents finding out about it happened before the creation of the TV show. My little two-parter on Josh Duggar was filmed long before Shiny Happy People and Counting the Cost came out. We need to unpack all of this and take a look at how the structure of these groups enables abuse and prevents victims from pursuing any kind of recourse. 1 second here. My lamp is in the way of the teleprompter and I don't want to have to reshoot the whole thing. So I'm just going to take a minute. There we go. Okay. So Josh confessed to the abuse. He told his parents about the abuse in 2002. He was courting at the time, and his girlfriend wrote him a letter expressing her anger about the whole thing, and she tucked this letter into a book. So in 2006, someone from their church borrowed this book, and then all hell broke loose. I'm going to share a longer quote from the book here because I'm going to butcher this if I try to put it into my own words. Quote, in 2006, the book was loaned to a friend at church and the letter resurfaced. It was read by someone who knew us, someone who attended the same church as us. Instead of talking with mom or pops, she got more information from church leadership, phoned a hotline, and informed DHS, Department of Human Services, about what she thought was a potentially abusive situation. Everything changed when we were in Chicago to record with Oprah and then attended our first IBLP headquarters Christmas party. Pops received a call notifying him of the investigation. As soon as the trip was over, myself, most of my sisters, and my parents all had to be interviewed. We attended a closed court session. People, strangers, would come to our house at random times to make sure there were locks on the doors and that everyone was sleeping where they were supposed to be sleeping. It was terrifying. I was frightened that I was going to say the wrong thing and someone was going to take us away from mom and pops. One wrong word, one bad answer, and I'll be the one who tears our family apart. I was bound up tight in my own fear, but not so tight that I didn't notice that Pops was feeling it too. He was angry. I had heard that the person who found the letter and phoned the hotline had also talked to a few other people in our church. While the details remained private, the story of my brother having problems spread throughout our small home church. Some of the families treated us kindly and with compassion, but I believed that others were jealous of our success with the television show and treated us with suspicion. They threw us to the wolves, Pop said when the investigation concluded. They did not stick up for us at all. They're the ones who made this happen. They're the ones who allowed DHS to investigate our family, even though we had already taken care of it. End quote. So, JD's definition of taking care of it was sending Josh off to the IBLP alternative of a proper psychiatric facility. He did manual labor and stuff like that, which, as we all know, isn't going to help with a complex problem like sibling CSA. The detail I'm about to mention wasn't in Jill's book. I found out about this during my research for my two-parter on Josh. So Josh had talked to a family friend who was a sheriff, and he basically gave Josh a proverbial bull slap on the wrist. Now, cops are mandatory reporters. Mandatory reporters are required by federal law to report reasonable suspicions of abuse. The woman who found this book did exactly the right thing. And anyone who works directly with children is a mandatory reporter. So that would include healthcare professionals, mental health professionals, teacher, clergy, and cops. Again, this is under federal law. This cop should have gone to prison. And later, he was charged with possession of child porn and was put in prison for that. Now, we all know that the US is in dire need of prison reform. But the plain fact is, some people do need to be contained so they can't cause more harm. There is another chilling but important detail. Now, remember how Josh had a girlfriend? Well, her father understandably lost his shit and asked JB when he was planning to disclose all of this to him and the rest of the girl's family. JB's answer was after she and Josh got married. Again, all of this was before the TV show. All right, we are going to end part 2 here, and part 3.
Hi, shalom. I am finally back with part 3 of my discussion of Counting the Cost by Jill Duggar Dillard. This is the final video in my little mini-series, and if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that I had to take an unplanned hiatus from this book and this topic to take care of my mental health, but I'm in a much better place now, Baruch Hashem, and I'm also getting much more proficient with using my new tablet, so video production is a lot faster than it used to be. Yay! Just like with reading parts 1 and 2, I will be holding up the book when I'm reading direct quotes, but I'll be looking forward because I'll be doing the actual reading from the teleprompter. I still like regular books, okay? Don't judge me. All right. Without further ado, let's pick up this discussion where we left off. Content note, this video contains mentions of exploitation and various forms of abuse. I will be as vague as possible. Viewer discretion is advised. Any references to the traditional male/female binary and traditional gender roles are in context and does not reflect my own views. As said, this is part 3. I've been going through the book in chronological order and breaking it down. If you haven't already seen parts 1 and 2, you'll want to do that first. Otherwise, none of this will make sense. I will link both of those parts down below. In part 1, I covered Jill's earlier childhood up until Josh's abuse in 2002. The abuse came to light in 2006, right before the creation of the show. DHS, Department of Human Services, got involved, and it was a whole thing, and yet, in spite of all of that, the show went on, literally. I'm going to give you a brief timeline of the Josh situation, and then the bulk of this video is going to be about Jim Bob's atrocious financial abuse against Jill and her husband, Derek. So, during all of this, there was the Ashley Madison scandal. That was some weird dating website thing for people cheating on their partners. Now, what two consulting adults do is their own business, provided there's nothing deceptive going on. I don't have any kind of moral judgment about that, okay? But this does not exactly fit that criteria. Then in 2019, Josh's used car dealership was raided by the feds when child porn was found on his computer. And that is me getting around these censors, not making light of anything. As many of you probably know, he was charged for that. I want to clarify that he was not charged for abusing his sisters due to the statute of limitations. Josh's current release date is December of 2032. It's been pushed back a few times. Personally, I think he should be there for life. While the criminal justice system needs a ton of reform in general, people like him are the reason I support the existence of it. There are some people who just should not be on the street. Okay? Okay. Now we'll move on to the financial abuse subject. I want to point out a couple things about the financial component of the show. The show's income allowed the family to construct a bigger house. And by construct, I mean they used the kids as unpaid labor as a big part of the building. When the show started, there were 14 kids, and as I said in my Cult of Personality series about the Duggars, excuse me, they could only do everything they did because of the income from the show. Most Quiverful families live in extreme poverty. Hold on, I'm having issues with the teleprompter. Give me a second. Here we go. Now, things wouldn't have been so bad if there were fewer kids in the family or if the mom worked, but that is not how the majority of these families do it. And when I say extreme poverty, I mean food scarcity is a major problem for a lot of these families because they don't want any kind of outside aid. I know survivors who were in this situation as children, and it is not pretty, to say the least. There are way too many adult survivors of these groups who have medical issues due to not getting enough to eat as kids. In the book, Jill mentioned that the income from the show enabled to get all kinds of like regular food, beyond just ramen. She specifically mentioned ramen, and that detail horrified me. I only crave ramen when I am massively dehydrated. I cannot imagine eating it all the time. Ugh. The other thing I want to point out is that the Duggar children were thrown into the show without understanding how television production works as a job/career. So they had no way of understanding that they were victims of child labor exploitation. Jill mentioned that a film crew from South Korea had them filming from 7 in the morning until 10 or 11 at night. I was talking to my therapist about the labor thing. We did some quick mental math and figured out that I often put in like 30 to 40 hours of unpaid church labor per week, and that was on top of part-time paid childcare. Severe health issues are disturbingly common in cult survivors. And if that's what it was like for me, I can't imagine how horrible it was for those poor kids. My therapist said that this fits the legal/technical definition of slave labor. I was hesitant to call it that because these groups are predominantly white. But my therapist said that black slavery is only one example of legal/technical slavery. If the definition of slavery is unpaid or underpaid labor in bad conditions, often under coercion, then this absolutely is slave labor. As said, in this world, children are not viewed as human beings with their own thoughts and emotions. Quote, I loved the times when we were all together, especially when it was just us Duggars. The presence of the film crew brought plenty of good things, but I quickly grew to dislike the way they sometimes wanted to spring surprises on us. I guess it made for good TV to see us react in real time to the news of whatever challenge or adventure they'd set up for us, even if it was just an escape room or a trip to a park. But it got to the point where I was feeling the stress nearly every time they were filming. Either I was trying to bury my discomfort and anxiety when they were springing a surprise on us, or my fake joy when we were filming something we'd already rehearsed. I had to keep my reality far away from the TV. End quote. Think about that last line. I had to keep my reality far away from the TV. This, my dear audience, is exactly why I say that reality TV is a contradiction in terms. As Jill became a teenager, the subject of romance inevitably came up. I've mentioned before that dating, as most people define it, is not a thing in this subculture. They do what they call courting, and I don't mean in an old days way, like more traditional approach to serious relationships. That is more traditional compared to today, but that is too liberal for this crowd. I'm talking about arranged marriage, essentially. They say it's not an arranged marriage, but if it walks like an arranged marriage and talks like an arranged marriage, it's a freaking arranged marriage. Quote, I knew my parents loved me and wanted what was best for me, so it wasn't like mom or pops were ever going to arrange our marriages or force us to marry someone. But without our parents' blessing, there was simply no way any relationship would ever be able to begin. Years and years of IBLB teaching had taught us that no good Christian child should ever consider going against our parents' wishes. Number one on the list of requirements in a future spouse was that we had the approval of our parents. Without that, it was game over before things had even begun. End quote. Jill met a guy named Derek through some acquaintance of Jim Bob. And I've said before that the Duggar family turned heads even in the South. Derek's background was much more liberal and normal in a lot of respects. He only had one brother, and he had gone to public school. Another prominent detail is that he was fine with girls and women wearing pants. And this is a huge thing in some of these groups. Not so much in the one I was in. There were women who wore pants, but a lot of them didn't. And yeah. As the relationship progressed, Jill became increasingly nervous about the idea of being forced to televise her future children's births. She could tell her mom was not a fan of doing that, as you might expect, but women do not have choices or autonomy in this world. And that brings us to Jill and Derek's wedding. I know I'm using a lot of direct quotes in discussing this book, but I feel like I just can't do all of this justice by paraphrasing. The part I'm about to read took place on the morning of Jill and Derek's wedding day. Quote, Hey, Pop said to some of the older siblings earlier in the day. Chad, one of the producers, and I have been finalizing some stuff on the new show, and I have some papers for you to sign here. Can you do it real quick before you leave? Sure, I said, not thinking much about it. Some of the big TLC and production people who weren't usually around were coming to town, so I imagine Pops was feeling more pressure than normal to get everything they needed together. What's this for? Oh, it's just about how you're going to get paid. I looked at the papers sitting on the dining room table. Single sheets with white signature lines with each of our names printed. A few had already been signed. I didn't see any extra papers to read, and I didn't really know what it was about, but I didn't question my dad. After all, in all of my life, I had never had a reason not to trust Pops. He knew best and always had, so I picked up the pen and signed. End quote. Now you're probably thinking, how stupid are you? I get it, but I can't emphasize enough that this is not about stupid. This is a totally normal scenario in this world. Men run everything, and women don't have any choice, especially when it comes to finances. I need to point out that the Duggar children didn't have much understanding of the employment side of television production. They were not receiving any kind of regular paycheck, even after they turned 18. Jim Bob controlled all of the money, and we'll be coming back to the topic of Jill's signature on that paper. Jim Bob and Michelle tried to exercise full control over their children even after they were adults and married with children of their own. When Jill got pregnant, her parents and TLC wanted to control when and how they announced their pregnancy. Not long after Jill had her baby, the old police report on Josh was illegally and unethically leaked to In Touch, a tabloid, with graphic details. Jill was coerced by her family into doing a PR damage control type interview with, surprise, surprise, Fox News. And Josh was in the room during said interview. Now, as I mentioned before, Derek's background was much more normal in a lot of respects, and his concerns about Jim Bob and the exploitation grew over time. He and Jill were pursuing their own lives and wanted to do mission work in El Salvador. You can probably tell how I feel about that topic on the whole, but for a lot of young people in this world, mission work was really the only socially acceptable reason to move away from their families and do their own thing. So they moved to El Salvador, but were still making trips back to the US to do filming work for TLC, and they were also expected to do a lot of filming remotely. And bear in mind, up to this point, they had never received any kind of formal salary. Derek grew increasingly concerned. He confronted Jim Bob about this, and Jill described her reaction as bracing for impact. I know that feeling all too well. I got it so many times in the cultiverse. Derek refused to budge, and eventually Jim Bob agreed he would give the older siblings $80,000 each, which sounds like a lot, but when you factor in the years and years of unpaid labor, it's really not. Derek and Jill got suspicious, and they soon learned what Jim Bob wanted in exchange for the $80,000. I can't do this justice by paraphrasing, so I'm going to read another direct quote. Hold on. Quote, "The contract wasn't with TLC or any other network. It was with Mad Family Inc., a company that Mom and Pops had previously set up. In return for the $880,000 for the next 7 years, plus an unlimited number of years beyond that if the company chose, we would have to commit to making not just ourselves, but our children, and any children yet to be born, available to any show that Mad Family Inc. created or participated in. We would be paid for that work as well, but at a rate we would have to accept without negotiation. we would also have to sign an NDA, means non-disclosure agreement, which would remain active for the rest of our lives. End quote. The part about future children is pretty much exactly how black slavery worked. I'm just saying. Okay, now we're coming back to that piece of paper that Jill signed on their wedding day. For timeline purposes, it is now 2017. I had forgotten to mention that Derek's educational background was in accounting, and he eventually went to law school. They talked to an attorney who had no connection to anyone else in the Duggar family, and the attorney advised them to ask for the full contract that Jill had signed. And not surprisingly, Jim Bob refused. Jill and Derek did everything they could to try to get out of that contract, and they did eventually quit filming for TLC in the summer of 2017, but unfortunately, that was not the end of Jim Bob's influence on their finances. In 2018, he committed tax fraud in Jill's name, and he even deceived his own accountant about the whole thing. Obviously, everything he did is extremely illegal, but as we all know, people with friends in high places can get away with a lot. Jill recounted her experiences with starting therapy and reading the book Boundaries by mainstream Christian psychologist Cloud and Townsend. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about that book. It's received some criticism from mainstream therapists for not being as scientifically sound as some of the other books out there. And it certainly isn't the most in-depth psychology book I've ever read, but I majored in early childhood. I did have to take some psychology courses, and it uses terms correctly, and it uses them in the context of well-known gospel stories of Jesus interacting with people. I read it a few times after my escape. This book has helped so many Fundy survivors heal and establish much needed boundaries with toxic people. The fact that this is coming from actual psychologists who are practicing Christians gives this book a lot of respect in the Fundy survivor community. All right, that is a wrap on counting the cost. Thanks again for bearing with me until I was ready to film this video, and I'm back soon. All right, bye.
If you enjoyed this video, please do me a huge favor and hit the thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon. Like you try. Oh, bye.